Good afternoon. My name is Jim Simons, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our 6th virtual convocation here at Monte Vista Grove in Pasadena, California. And it's exciting to me that I can be sitting here in Pasadena, and our speaker is sitting in Dunedin, New Zealand, and we will have our program together. There's Kerry Enright waving to everybody. Not only do we have the chance of hearing Carrie from New Zealand, but we're able to converse with him. And so if you have a question, you can hit the chat icon at the bottom of your computer and type in a question, or if you want to hit the raise your hand icon, you can have a spoken question, and Lindsay Mansis will bring you in after Carrie gives his talk. So I'm aware that right now we have a number of people from both Australia and New Zealand. And so I want to greet particularly our New Zealand friends, kia ora, the word that everybody knows in New Zealand. And it's a Maori word, which is a warm greeting that everybody shares in New Zealand. We begin our convocations with scripture, and so today, at the suggestion of Carrie Enright, we will be reading Philippians 4, verses 4 to 9. Let me read the first 3 verses, and then we'll all together read the last 2 verses. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. The Lord is near. Do not worry about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. And now together, finally, beloved, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, and if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Keep on doing the things that you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, and the God of peace will be with you. This is the word of the Lord. And for our prayer, we're going to say the words of my favorite New Zealand hymn, Where Mountains Rise, a hymn written by Shirley Murray, who is a magnificent hymn writer. And for those who are Presbyterians in our audience, our hymn book, Glory to God, has, count them, 10 hymns by Shirley Murray in our hymn book. One of the things Shirley Murray does is to draw on the Maori tradition. And you'll see in this hymn, in the second verse, there's 2 Maori words. Aroha is the Maori word for all-embracing love. And mana is the word for dignity, prestige. And they are both crucial, I think, to the point of this hymn. So join with me on the last verse, and I'll read the first 4 verses. Where mountains rise to open skies, your name, O God, is echoed far. From island beach to Cowrie's reach, in water's light, in lake and star. Your people's heart, your people's part be in our caring for this land, for faith to flower, for aroha to let each other's mana stand. From broken word, from conflict stirred, from lack of vision, set us free to see the line of your design, to feel creation's energy. Your love be known, compassion shown, that every child have equal scope. In justice done, in trust begun, shall be our heritage and hope. And now together, where mountains rise to open skies, your way of peace distill the air. Your spirit bind all humankind, one covenant of life to share. Amen. Amen. Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce the Reverend Dr. Carrie Enright, who has both British and Maori ancestry, and who, as a young man, was a lawyer who felt inspired to go to theological seminary. So he went to seminary in New Zealand and then went to Princeton Seminary here in the United States, and also to San Francisco Theological Seminary. Kerry was the pastor of several congregations before he became the general minister of the Presbyterian Church in New Zealand, the stated clerk of the General Assembly. That would be the parallel in our church here in the United States. And I met Perry in 2001 when I did the first of several short-term ministries, interim ministries in New Zealand. And I was immediately struck by the fact that when you met Carrie, you felt somehow affirmed. You know, some people just make others so comfortable that they feel good about being in their presence. So great empathy is a quality of Carrie's. The church had a lot of conflicts, just like the church in the United States, and Carrie was a good reconciler. And part of his skill as a reconciler is because he has an absolutely delightful sense of humor. He diffuses tension by his humor. So quite a remarkable person. Carrie, after 10 years in this job, went to Australia, worked on international partnerships with the Uniting Church in Australia, and then came back to New Zealand, to Dunedin, and to the historic Knox Church in Dunedin. Earlier this year, in March, Ron and Cynthia White and Patty and I had the chance to visit Kerry at his church because he hosted one of the lectures that Ron gave on leadership and Lincoln. And it was a delight to be with him in that church. And the audience was filled with all kinds of good, excellent questions. And we enjoyed being there. And Kerry, our delightful host. He speaks today on our theme, Living into Hope, the theme of convocations for the fall, but from a particular New Zealand perspective, and particularly dealing with the pandemic and how we move through the pandemic. Carrie, it's a delight to welcome you to our convocation here at Monte Vista Grove.
Well, greetings to you in Pasadena. Jim will translate as we go my inadequate English into the true American English. So I'm glad to see some people shaking their heads. I'm going to begin by greeting you in the language of the indigenous people of Aotearoa of New Zealand in Maori. So just a little while in Maori, and then I'll tell you what I've said. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Tuarua ki te mate, haere, haere, haere ki, haere atura. Ka mihi ke te iwi kainga ki te iwi Pasadena. Pasadena, kia ora. Kia tātou e tau nei ka nui taku mihi. Nō reira tēnā koutou katoa. Ko tainui te waka, ko taupiri te maunga, ko waikato te awa, ko waikato te iwi, ko tuheitia te kini, ko aireroa te marae, ko tiramati toko tipuna, ko Kerry ahau. So that's, I'm greeting you. What I said was, firstly, greetings to everybody. Secondly, we remember Torua. Secondly, we remember those who have died. We say farewell. Haere, haere, haere ra. Mihi, greetings from the people of this land to the people of Pasadena, to your communities. And greetings to you all. Then I talked a little about myself. So my canoe, canoe that brought my people to New Zealand, called Tainui. My mountain is Taupiri. My river is the Waikato River. My people are the Waikato people. My king is Tuheitia, Maori king. My marae, my spiritual home, is called Urairoa. My Maori ancestor is Tiramate, and my great-great-grandmother, and my name is Kerry. So greetings to you, no reira, tēnā koutou katoa. So, well, I want to thank you very much for the invitation to be with you this afternoon. It's midday here in Dunedin, and the temperature is bordering 9, oh, you're Fahrenheit. I'm not very good at Fahrenheit. Celsius 9 to 10, eh? And I want to begin by just saying that this is an offering by way of gratitude, because through my ministry, through my life, I have received much from the United States, and particularly from the Presbyterian Church USA. Many New Zealanders, unfortunately, turn towards Scotland when they look for some theological grounding. But I was fortunate as a student to have a minister who called John Mackay, the president of Princeton Seminary, my good friend John Mackay. So it was inevitable that I ended up at Princeton Seminary when I was doing some postgraduate work, and then down in San Francisco. And of course, being stated clerk here in New Zealand, I got to know the stated clerk then, Cliff Kirkpatrick, in New Zealand. And our daughter, our youngest daughter, was sufficiently inspired by all of this interaction that she had, as in one of her school years, a year in Oklahoma, and we visited her. So this offering is by way of gratitude, Gratitude. So I'm going to speak about the theme. I'll speak from naturally a New Zealand perspective. I want to speak about the pandemic, talk about our response to that, what's come as a result of that, and then I want to broaden out to speak about global things. Hope not too pretentiously. But let me talk a little bit by way of introduction to New Zealand, geography. Well, we're an island nation, and we're 3 hours flight to the nearest big land, Australia, and 3 hours flight to the near Pacific Island nations. We're part of the Pacific, and we're on the edge of Asia. South of us, from here, Dunedin's in the south of the South Island, south of us is Antarctica, which in winter is rather too close, I have to say. We're multicultural with Maori, the indigenous, European, Pacific Islands, Asian. And we are a small nation, very small. We feel a small nation, a population of 5 million people. So that when the world notices us for various reasons, there is a shared pride. The Lord of the Rings winning a few prizes. Sir Edmund Hillary climbing Mount Everest for the first time. And of course, our rugby team, the All Blacks, when they win the Rugby World Cup. That's as close as New Zealanders get to ecstasy. So, because of our relative isolation and our size, many New Zealanders travel overseas. And one of our defining characteristics is that everywhere from here is overseas. We talk about going overseas. And again, I think because of our isolation and our size, we have a vital interest in world affairs. Geography is one of our core school subjects. People in the United States are often surprised when I say that one of the things that we studied at school was the Tennessee Valley Authority. Why? Well, hydroelectric power, agriculture, and all of that. Huh? But the other aspect to us is that our country is young geologically. The tops of our mountains are still sharp, unlike the rounded Australians. Earthquakes are common, and there are parts of our country where volcanoes are still active, geysers burst forth, mud pools bubble away. So we live on moving tectonic plates, and we're conscious of it. Almost every day I'm conscious that we're moving on tectonic plates. For just over 10 years ago, an earthquake devastated our second largest city. The city centre was destroyed, buildings collapsed, people killed. And the damage was so severe, it's now I think 11 years, the rebuilding has still got a long way to go. People are still affected by the trauma of it. I'll speak a little about our history shortly, but I want to speak just about our place here in Dunedin. The first people to settle here, of course, were Maori. They came about 800 years ago. And then 700 years or so later came people mainly from Scotland to this community, and they called it Dunedin, which is the Gaelic name for Edinburgh. Billy Connolly said they came here because it was the most like home. It was cold and inhospitable. So now let me talk about COVID and our response to it. Well, it's been a year of living under a shroud. That's what it feels like, living under a shroud. And at the end of it, I've noticed among people in our congregation and more widely, this sense of tiredness and exhaustion. But now we're emerging, what a sense of relief there is. The first case was reported at the end of February. The pandemic peaked in April with 89 new cases recorded each day. As of yesterday, we have had a total of 1,520 cases. 25 people, only 25, well, I shouldn't say only, 25 people have died from the virus. There are 42 current cases, but they're of people who have come from overseas and they're in quarantine facilities. They're in managed isolation. There have not been any cases in the wider community for many weeks. Now, near the start of the pandemic, the government imposed strict limits with the aim of eliminating the virus as far as possible. And it established 4 alert levels according to the seriousness and the requirements of the restrictions. And we quickly went into the highest level, level 4. What did that mean? Well, it meant we could not move beyond our immediate neighborhood. We could go to the supermarket, but we couldn't basically move more than 2 or 3 kilometers from our homes. We had to stay within the bubble of people with whom we lived. We were expected to work from home. We couldn't go to work outside the home. We weren't together socially. We weren't to worship together. And so you can imagine with this kind of limitation, what a change it made to people's lifestyles just for a few weeks. Wonderful thing. We heard the sound of silence. And birdsong became louder than the sound of trucks and cars. That was wonderful. But something else happened as well. People looked out for each other. Neighbors looked after neighbors. Younger people did grocery shopping for older people. People would stop on the street in front of the house and you'd talk with them from a distance. That didn't happen before. Travel to and from New Zealand, of course, was severely limited, and a second surge of cases in June, unfortunately, finally dissipated last month. Last month, most of the country, most of New Zealand, returned to the lowest level of restrictions. We're still encouraged to use our Tracer app to log in whenever we go to a facility or an event. We're to be thoughtful about using our masks. We're to be thoughtful about physical distancing, and we're perpetually washing our hands. More than half of New Zealanders have a government tracing app on their cell phones. That means when you go in, you just log in from the kind of screen, the pattern at the door. In the midst of this, we learned a lot about good leadership. Politicians listened to public health professionals and took their advice. For several months, the Prime Minister and the Director General of Health gave briefings at 1 p.m. each day. And these daily briefings became the must-watch event of the day. And in my view, as much as anything, they helped settle the spirit of our nation. Their messages, these two people, were clear, consistent, easily understood. They anticipated what people needed to know. They answered all the questions that people asked. The Director General of Health, who was previously fairly an unknown figure, became quite popular. He was straightforward, he was careful, he exuded honesty and helpfulness, he was compassionate, he was sensitive, and I would say he was the epitome of a good public servant. Independent advice without any political favour whatsoever. And you may have heard of our Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, an excellent communicator, personable, empathetic, engaging, emphasising kindness, emphasising care for the vulnerable. Now, of course, there was also criticism. Some public health professionals said, we're not doing enough. Some political leaders found everything that they could find wrong with what the government did, naturally. But in the midst of it, there was something we did unprecedented here, an innovation. Because Parliament was unable to meet and to debate, they established a committee with the purpose of scrutinising the government's actions. And it was led not by a government figure, but by the leader of the opposition. And it had people from every political party on it. So that brought a degree of robust scrutiny. And I think it built up people's confidence in the way we were going. Well, as a result of all this, trust grew. So let me just give you a couple of poll figures. In April, a poll found that trust in the Ministry of Health and the government's ability to manage the pandemic was 91%.
Oh my gosh.
91%. That's even with Scottish people, you know, 91%. And there were some failures in June, but it was still at 82% in August. It also found that in April, 75% of New Zealanders totally trusted the government and the Ministry of Health. And although there were some lapses in June, by August, it was still at 64%. So in general terms, New Zealanders believe that we have come through the pandemic as well as any nation. Of course, there are conspiracy theorists, but they have limited support. Tomorrow, we complete our election process. You've got a couple more weeks to go. Good luck. And but tomorrow, our election season finishes, and by the end of tomorrow, we'll know whether the present government will be returned to power. COVID, of course, like as in the United States, has had a major impact on our economy. We are in a period of recession now. Unemployment is growing. Tourism has slumped, naturally. Borrowing is increasing. We're not into the trillions. Inequality is more evident, and there are tough times ahead. But I think that what has emerged is a sense of being a team of 5 million people, and a sense that we need to care for each other, especially for the vulnerable. And the question is, how can we build on these sentiments, on this spirit at this time? Now I can see somebody's asked me a question, and I'll have to see how I find it. Oh, good. Hello, Debbie. All right. So now, sentiments. I was talking about those. Another catastrophe brought us together last year. On the 15th of March last year, 51 people were killed while they prayed in two Muslim mosques. Now, this is unprecedented for us, and it really shook us as a nation. Because it was unprecedented, because it involved assault weapons, because it was religiously focused, because it had been fomented by hate groups. The man who did the killing came from overseas, but he lived for a time, for a few months, in our communities. And one of the things that really shook people was that he was just living just down the road, one of their neighbours. How could he ever do something like this? Well, the country gathered together around Muslim people, around Muslim communities. Every major city, many smaller centres had prayer vigils or events expressing solidarity. And here in Dunedin, in a city of just over 100,000 people, 15,000 people gathered in our sports stadium. And one of the enduring images of that time was the degree to which the Governor-General and our political leaders expressed the deep felt anguish of us all. A poignant photo of our Prime Minister wearing a veil, embracing one of the survivors. Empathy evident. And many churches, including our own, reached out to the local Muslim community, and many Muslim people came into our church, at least, and I imagine others, for the first time ever. It was a terrible, terrible event, and yet it somehow awakened in us a deep concern for each other. Within 3 weeks of this event, the government introduced legislation to ban assault weapons, and within 3 weeks of that, the law was enacted with one dissenting vote, so that the registration of guns and of shooters was significantly strengthened. Assault weapons were banned. And this is in a nation where police don't normally carry guns. I remember arriving in the United States and being confronted with police with guns. I'd never seen it before. So the Muslim community, in its responding, also showed what grace feels like and looks like. It was incredibly amazing. Now, one of the gifts of being a small country is that leaders are close to the people. Let me talk a little about Jacinda. She became Prime Minister 3 years ago at the age of 37. She grew up in a small rural town. Her father was a local policeman, and she grew up in a Mormon family. But she left that faith, and one of the reasons is because of their attitude towards people who are LGBTQI+. Involved in politics in the United Kingdom and then in New Zealand, and she was eventually elected to Parliament. For several years, we'd had a conservative government, and Labour, the more liberal government, wasn't doing very well in the polls. And not long before the 2017 election, the then leader of the Labour Party recognised he wasn't winning widespread support. So he resigned. And that's when Jacinda became leader, and then a few weeks later, Prime Minister. It was an act of remarkable humility. And one of the things that I feel about our politicians, and I've been in the unusual situation, every congregation of which I've been a minister has had the local member of parliament as a member, including here in Dunedin. We seem to have politicians who largely, overall, are not driven by ego. So if it's not working, they step aside. We also have, I think, quite an inclusive political system. Maori have been represented in Parliament since 1867. We were the first country to give women the vote in 1893. And we work on a system whereby if a political party gets 5%, it meets a threshold of 5% of the vote, of the national vote, they're entitled to representation in the Parliament. And so it means that even if people don't vote for the largest parties, the two largest parties, they can see that the party they voted for is represented in the Parliament somehow. And often when there's a coalition, no larger party can rule on its own. It needs other parties to form a coalition government. So if the parties form a coalition government, people can see that in some ways, even if they're in a minority of a kind, their views are represented, including at the cabinet table. And I think that's quite a uniting aspect. Let me now speak a bit about our history, because these responses, this unity, and there are major issues, I have to say, but this unity comes from a certain soil. As I mentioned earlier, the indigenous people called Maori arrived about 800 years ago. Accomplished navigators, fishers, farmers, traders, very accomplished. And those who came after Maori are called Pākehā. White people are called Pākehā people. In the late 1700s, Pākehā explorers arrived, then whalers, then settlers. And through the early 1800s, land companies brought people mainly from the United Kingdom. The demand for land began to disrupt Maori settlement. So in 1840, Queen Victoria and Maori chiefs, in order to secure some order in our country, signed a treaty called the Treaty of Waitangi. It's a foundational document. Immediately, there were misunderstandings because the translations in English and Maori differed. Maori had no concept of individual ownership. So when they signed the treaty, they thought that what they were doing was the Queen was securing their ownership, but they were leasing the land to Pākehā people. Well, she didn't protect Maori rights. And so major tracts of land went to the Pākehā. Maori became increasingly alienated. And so in the early 1860s, finally they rebelled and there were land wars. The British had bigger guns, they won. But there are some inspiring stories from this time. By this stage, many Maori people were Christian, and they took the Bible seriously. So in the middle of a battle, for example, and there are stories like this, a British soldier might lie there, wounded, dying. A Maori warrior would creep down, bullets firing, war and all this kind of thing happening around, and take the soldier, drag them back, and care for them. And this a long time before the Geneva Convention. And more than that, there were Maori leaders who said, on the basis of the Bible, we cannot fight, we cannot go to war. And so they became imaginative, creative, about non-violent protests. Amazingly creative. And this is a long time before Mahatma Gandhi. Anyway, Maori were left extremely poor, small pockets of land, grievances. And for more than a century, they pressed for the treaty to be honoured. And finally, in the 1980s, the Treaty of Waitangi was recognised as part of the land, of the law of our country, enforceable. And so the government was required to compensate Maori for the loss of their land, the loss of their resources, as far as it was possible. They did so by handing a lot of the land back, by making monetary compensation. And that gave a financial basis for Maori tribes to begin to develop. Now, of course, it was enough. It was something, but it wasn't enough. And so colonization, as you know, continues to have terrible effects on indigenous people, and that's certainly true here in New Zealand. What time, Jim, when I get to 35 minutes, I wasn't watching.
No, keep going for what, another 10 minutes? Five or 10 minutes?
5 or 10 minutes, I can do that. And thank you to the dog for the explanation. That dog understands New Zealand English, I can see. So decolonization continues to be a major project here. And we're still learning how to develop together, indigenous people and immigrants. We have 3 languages recognized, English, Maori, and the sign language. And at Knox Church, where I'm one of the ministers, we try to incorporate, well, we do incorporate Maori language in every service in some way. And the Maori name of our country, Aotearoa, is increasingly used. So the treaty is one of the factors that's helped bind us together. But there have been other developments in our history as well. Our attention to social well-being. Recent budgets over the last 2 or 3 years have focused not just on GDP, not just on financial outcomes, but also on well-being outcomes. So the government has introduced a system of a well-being budget, and they're beginning to develop measures of well-being so that when a government presents a budget for adoption to the Parliament, It isn't just about, how much is the economy growing, but how are we addressing inequality? How are we reducing child poverty? How are we enabling our environment to flourish? These become measures of the government's effectiveness in our budgets, which are good steps, I think, more a holistic approach. But one of the things about our history has been this concern to provide a safety net for people who are unable to care for themselves or people who are poor. And as in the United States, important steps were taken after the Great Depression. I just want to talk about one aspect of that. Not very far from here, about an hour and a half north of Dunedin, is a river valley, one of the major rivers in the South Island. And the government of the time wanted to build dams on the river to generate electricity. But the workers that were brought in lived in very poor conditions. And in a small town nearby, there was the local Presbyterian minister, the school principal, and the local doctor. And they noticed the poverty. They noticed the terrible conditions. They sat down at the kitchen table and they began to map out what kind of system New Zealand needed in order to bring people out of that situation. Well, two of them got elected to Parliament. And it wasn't long before they became cabinet ministers. Their party was elected to government. They became cabinet ministers. And from that, well, we got free healthcare, free education, largely. It's still somewhat in play, although it's been compromised a bit by government. And a social welfare system to care for people who are unable to care for themselves. That came from a group that are known here in New Zealand as the Three Wise Men. And yes, in fact, the Presbyterian Minister went on to be leader of the party and for a while, Arnold Nordmeyer. So there's this sense, so when you have that kind of system, you do have a sense, you're able to have a sense of unity, of caring for each other. Is Maori language taught in the public schools? Yes, it is. Not universally, sadly, and there are a lot of variances, but to the person who asked the question, yes, at school I learned some Maori, but it's a bit variable according to the school and the teachers. And it isn't always taught very well, but there's certainly a commitment to it. So where am I up to? So one of the things that happened was this. I think there was a valuing in our country for a while of the importance of equality. It wasn't a country where you flaunted wealth. It wasn't a country where ostentation was frowned on. And you didn't talk about personal wealth. It just wasn't something to be talked about. But in the 1980s, as in the United States and in other aspects of the world, neoliberal economic policies have widened inequality and influenced our culture, and particularly over the last 10 years. So education and health remain somewhat free, but there are people, some people, who now can buy extra privileges. It's interesting that the politicians who introduced those policies in the 80s and early 90s have now become critics of those policies. Very interesting, they've changed their minds. I want to finish with just talking a wee bit about our foreign policy and then some global issues. The 1980s also saw an increasingly independent foreign policy. We're not a non-aligned country, but we are nervous about the bigger powers. We have a very strong anti-nuclear movement. We have a bipartisan policy among conservatives and liberals banning ships with nuclear weapons, for which the United States government punished us, of course, by suspending ANZUS, the agreement between Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. Around the same time, the French secret police bombed a Greenpeace ship in Auckland Harbour, it's our largest city, which led to incredible national condemnation. And we've been at the forefront of some anti-apartheid demonstrations as well. So this sense of activism by a small country, quite a long way from other people, is one of our features, I think. particularly against more powerful countries. And I see it as a sign of hope for us as a nation as we move forward. So just a few conclusions before I talk a wee bit about global. What have we found? Inequality divides. Inequality divides and undermines the well-being of the nation. The impact of colonization needs constant, consistent attention. Everyone has to be brought along. A nation will not flourish unless everybody somehow is brought along. Without that, the fabric of the nation just tears apart. And to bring people along requires people to have hearts of compassion and systems of inclusion. Good leadership lifts everyone up, inspires kindness, compassion, thoughtfulness, and attention to the difficult issues. Now, I don't want to paint a rosy picture of New Zealand. Some of our statistics are horrifying, particularly around gender-based violence, particularly around youth suicide, particularly around child poverty. Not doing well at all. But let me speak more widely and perhaps a little more dramatically. Climate change remains our biggest challenge. Our Pacific neighbours are among the most vulnerable to rising sea levels. The nations of Tuvalu, Tokelau, Kiribati, parts of other nations in the Pacific, barely 6 feet above sea level, increasingly uninhabitable. Their coastal lines are crumbling. High waters, high tides wash over their whole countries. Crops are dying. Cyclones more frequent. As a result, people are having to relocate. And you may have heard Pacific leaders becoming more vocal about the pollution. And of course, the polluters are just simply not listening. We need, I think, to keep agitating to reduce carbon emissions and to transform our economies. Unbridled capitalism is doing enormous harm. It is stunting our humanity as we become seen as units of consumerism and puppets of advertising. The neoliberal experiment has failed. It is making the rich richer. It's killing our planet. And I have seen, when I visited churches in Asia, how our thirst for cheap goods does harm to incredibly underpaid workers. It's good that the World Council of Churches and the World Communion of Reformed Churches are working on a new economic architecture. And of course, you know, the Pope has been forceful in his condemnation. We need to develop a new economic system for our world, and with it, a much better tax system. Companies are shifting profits to minimize tax. In my view, it's evil, pure and simple. And our faith in human progress, in inevitable human progress, and this kind of putting at the pinnacle of achievement, humankind, needs rethinking. We need to have common cause with indigenous people who have a much more holistic view of creation, and I think with a thirst for shalom. We need to live within the limits of our creatureliness, to get over the idea that we can live in invincible bubbles, somehow create them, immune to all the vicissitudes of climate change and the rest. If anything, the virus has reminded us of our common vulnerability and our need to care for each other. And I think that in itself is a gift. I see great hope in the younger people in our congregation, a profound commitment to the well-being of our planet. And what do they want from us? I'm 67 years old. They want a community of support and encouragement and hope without this kind of terrible pall of cynicism that's so evident around. But for that, our church needs a good godly vision and not become self-absorbed. So there you go. There you go. From the bottom of the world, a tenacious hope. And I pray that that fierce, tenacious hope doesn't leave me until my breath leaves me. So, tihei Maori ora, no reira tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. How about that? More questions?
Okay, guys, it's Q&A time, so you can go ahead and type your questions in the chat box, or you can use the raise hand function, which is under your participants panel, and I will unmute you. I see one raised hand. And Carrie, are you fielding your own questions? Are you looking at the chat box?
I'm looking at the chat box. I've answered one of the questions, and I'll answer the last one. What is New Zealand's immigration policy? So, well, what is New Zealand's immigration policy? Well, there are limits on immigration, limits on numbers. They're not limits in terms of race or anything like that. They're limits in terms of just sheer numbers, and I think there's a kind of gradation of, you know, if you meet these requirements, then you're more likely to come in. We've had immigration is quite significant here. When there are sectors of our society that need work or support, for example, we're a significantly dairy farming country, but we don't have enough dairy farmers. So there's been quite an influx of people from the Philippines. So we have a lot of, I was talking to a man last Saturday who he's from Zimbabwe. He's become a dairy farmer. So yes, there's some diversity among immigration, but the figures aren't great.
Okay, Bill Craig, did you have a question?
Okay, you can hear me okay?
Yes.
I can, and I can understand you.
Carrie, I want to tell you, you mentioned what it means to people of New Zealand when the world notices. Well, the most recent issue of Time magazine highly commends New Zealand for two things: the go hard, go early response to the COVID-19 that has been so effective, and secondly, the conduct of the campaign for a new prime minister, and it is called by Time magazine a model of decency. I suppose if I have a question following this, it would be to ask you if New Zealanders are acquainted with our first debate
Yes.
for president, that it was not really a model of decency.
No, the first debate was interesting, wasn't it? Yeah, the man, Mr. Biden, didn't know quite what to do, did he? He was in a difficult situation. Very difficult situation.
So New Zealand's acquainted with what's going on here.
Well, some New Zealanders are, certainly I am. Every Saturday about lunchtime, I watch Shields and Brooks on PBS for 13 minutes. So, yeah.
Thank you.
New Zealanders have a strong sense of what's happening in the United States. Very strong sense. So there's another question in the chat box from Bryce Little. How do the New Zealanders see our current USA election process?
Yeah.
Complex. Very complex. I saw an article earlier in the week comparing our two systems, and the point made was our system works in a small nation. It simply would not work in the United States. The United States is such a large country, big population. You need a different kind of system. But yes, it's a, how do we see it? Well, I don't know what to say. Complex. We feel sad, I guess, that a person like Mr. Trump gets elected.
I can't see this.
Nancy Mackie.
Yes, can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, yes. First, I'll give you a little bit of context for my question. My last name is M-A-C-K-Y, and my late husband was a New Zealander.
Right.
His ancestor, Reverend John Mackey, in the mid-19th century, was the first moderator of the Presbyterian Church in New Zealand, in Auckland.
Oh.
So I'm delighted to hear your wonderful accent. I've been to New Zealand and loved the warm reception that we got there. My question is, does the Presbyterian Church in New Zealand, is it vocal in your elections? As some our conservative Christians are very vocal in our elections, but is the church active in your elections?
I'm going to try and sound as positive as I can about my own church. Well, firstly, your husband's ancestor, so there were two Presbyterian churches in New Zealand until 1901. So south of the Waitangi River, which is just north of here, the south, there was the Southern Presbyterian Church. It was mainly free church in origin. And eventually they joined together in 1901. I'm mainly a northerner, and I've only been in the south for 6 years. They are different down here. So my own denomination, how sad. Look, its social voice is very weak, very, very weak. It doesn't have the theological grounding, and it doesn't have the spiritual vitality that enables it at a national level to speak into the issues of our day. At an individual level and at a congregational level, that isn't so. So in my congregation, for example, until recently, our Minister of Health, it was a Presbyterian minister. He's a member of our congregation. So they're very active in government. The Minister of Finance is the son of one of my Presbyterian friends, and she worked for me when I was a General Secretary. So he's been steeped in that. But and we have people who have involved in various aspects of New Zealand's national life. So that's at a congregational level, but at a national level, I don't know what's happened. We've lost our courage. We've lost our theological convictions to speak into. But on the other hand, at the University of Otago, which is immediately adjacent to our church, there is a chair of theology and public issues. And so they are very prominent. And we have 2 referenda underway. So that means one is to do with end of life. So whether we support assisted dying, so it's coming for a public referendum. So that Christians and churches have been quite vocal, not on just one side in relation to that, but vocal on that. And we're also having a vote on whether to legalize marijuana, the smoking of marijuana. So yes, so at a personal level, at a congregational level, there has been input into these kind of issues, but at a national level, we are very silent at the moment. Terribly sad for us old jokers to look at.
Thank you.
Does that answer you?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Yeah. The name Mackie, of course, is very well known in New Zealand among people like me who know a little of our history as a church.
Yes. Well, you've made New Zealand very attractive to us, and I think you may see an influx of immigrants from Pasadena, so watch out.
Well, this Sunday, I'm not going to be there, but this Sunday the preacher is from Portland, Oregon.
All right, let's continue with questions. I'm gonna do a new thing. We're gonna try polling you guys today. You should have a poll on your screen. We just want to collect some demographics. So continue with questions, but if you'll just answer that when you have a moment. And again, if you want to raise your hand to ask a question, you can hit the participant panel down at the bottom of your screen. It should bring up a panel on the right-hand side, and there should be an option to raise your hand. Or you can also type it in the chat.
How do I get this? I've got a question, but I can't get it in there.
Why don't you just ask it, Jim, verbally?
Yes, Carrie, the connection between the Presbyterian Church and the Maori people is very strong, at least it has been in the past. And there has been a Maori synod. I know when Pamela Tankersley was moderator, she did a lot of things working with Maori people and returning some lands that the church owned to the Maoris, and speaking at Waitangi, you know, in the North Island. What's the connection now between Maori people and the Presbyterian Church, and particularly the Maori Synod?
Yeah, so Jim is right. From 1952, Maori have had their own synod or presbytery, not a geographical presbytery, a national presbytery for Maori. Eh? And the history, so the Presbyterian Church was not among the first among the first churches to come to New Zealand. The first churches that came to New Zealand, and they came as missionary churches, was the Anglican Church from Britain, the Wesleyans, the Methodists, and the Catholics. The Catholics mainly from France and then later from Ireland. So they were the early churches, and they came as missionary churches. The Presbyterian Church came a little later in the 1840s. 1842 was the first Presbyterian people, and mainly here in the south in Dunedin, as I've indicated. But they were spread through the country. So, and they came not for the indigenous people. They didn't come as a missionary church, they came as a settler church. They came for the settlers with the settlers. So that affected quite a bit of our history of engagement with Maori until the early 1900s, where the Presbyterian Church became more thoughtful about these matters. And there is a remote part of New Zealand called the Ureweras, a mountain range, and there was a New Zealander, Pākehā New Zealander, who went to settle there among Maori, a Presbyterian minister. And at that time, there was a Maori leader, a prophet. Maori in New Zealand have a history of prophetic figures, prophetic leaders, often arising from the alienation of land. So the prophetic figures would draw on particularly passages from the Old Testament to speak of the promise of the land being returned to Maori. And these prophetic leaders, some of them non-violent, some were used arms, they became a feature of New Zealand. And in the Ureweras, there was a Maori prophet named Ruakenana, who became friendly with the local Presbyterian missionary, Hoani Lawton. And eventually, the prophet said to Mr. Lawton, "You look after the children, I'll look after the adults." And in a way, from that agreement back in the early 1900s, the Maori work of the Presbyterian Church began, or at least it grew significantly. And so they developed, and eventually in 1952, as I indicated, Maori had its own synod. And here, as a result of that, well, there have been all kinds of developments. It isn't very strong, I have to say, numerically. But here in Dunedin at the University of Otago, where we have a theology department, they have just appointed the Reverend Dr Wayne Takawa, who's just completed his PhD, and he's a lecturer in Maori theology. So he's a Presbyterian minister, and he teaches Maori theology at the university. And increasingly, and we're one of the congregations, we're trying to develop a calendar of at least 3 major events in New Zealand which emphasize the partnership between the Crown and Maori. So those events are the Treaty of Waitangi, so we want to make more of Waitangi Day. There's Matariki. So Matariki is the Maori word for the constellation of stars around New Zealand in the middle of the year. And it represents the new year for Maori people. So we want to be able to celebrate Matariki. In fact, the government has just created a new holiday called Matariki. So it's a holiday. And then the third feast that we want to honour, celebrate as a particularly identifiably New Zealand celebration is to do with Parihaka. Do you remember in my talk, I talked about non-violent prophets. So one of the non-violent Maori prophets was Te Whiti o Rangamai, and he lived in Parihaka. At the time, the settlers were taking the land, and the surveyors would come along and put in pegs, showing where settlers could live. Maori came along and pulled up the pegs, day after day after day, week after week. Non-violent protest. The British Army came in, killed some of the people, but Te Whiti remained a pacifist. And so this story of Parihaka is a story of incredible commitment to Christian ways, but also of terrible oppressive actions. So this mix of hope and shocking behavior becomes something we want to mark, Parihaka. So, and increasingly, Maori, the language, Te Reo Maori, the Maori language is being used, promoted, used, including in our in worship. And Shirley Murray, as we had that hymn at the beginning, it just uses one or two words in some of her hymns. So there is this sense. I worked for 7 years in Australia, and here in New Zealand, and this is certainly true for me, I think, part of my identity is, if you ask me what is a New Zealander, what's the identity of a New Zealander, my identity arises from my place in the Treaty of Waitangi. So I'm, as a Pākehā, I'm here because of the treaty. I can only stay here because of the treaty. The Maori people are here because they're people of the land. They're tangata whenua. Whenua is the placenta which after birth gets reburied in the soil. And so they're people of the land. They're people of the, like the placenta being buried. Eh? And my identity as a New Zealander is certainly as a person of the treaty, but it's also as a person in relationship with and partnership with the indigenous people of New Zealand. That's part of who I am. I can't think of myself other than living on the land of the first peoples here. This is their land, ever before it was Pākehā land, and I'm in relationship with Pākehā people. So,
Kerry,
is that enough, Jim?
That's a beautiful statement, and our time is up. And one of the things that I've always loved about the Presbyterian Church in New Zealand that it is not the Presbyterian Church of New Zealand. It's the Presbyterian Church of Aotearoa, New Zealand. So the Maori word is included in the name of the national church. And I want to thank you so much for your honesty and your vision. And here we talked about hope as the theme for our convocations. You certainly express a hopeful attitude about people of New Zealand and really the role New Zealand plays in the rest of the world. So thank you so much for...
You're welcome, Jim. Can I say something by way of, I see there's another question, but anyway. Every person who is listening is specifically invited one day to come here to Aotearoa. I may not be the minister. If you come to Dunedin, although it's close to Antarctica, you may not want to come. If you turn up at the congregation and you say, I was part of that Zoom call, well, they'll give you a free cup of tea.
All right. Thank you so much. And we'll take you up on that.
Aye.
All right. Thank you so much, Gary. Very
Okay.
good.
Right.
So next week we have another really excellent program with Steve Bell as our speaker. And his title of his talk is Conversation with a Lifer. because he was incarcerated for 17 years and decided that he would make a contribution to other prisoners. So he's dealing with the problem of illiteracy among prisoners, its effects on public safety, the work of the Prison Library Project, and he will be our, he's the director of that library project. He will be our speaker next week. Thank you so much for watching. And once again, thank you to Carrie and Enright.
No worries.
No worries, mate.
No worries, mate. Bye-bye.